In Lagos, where every sunrise burns gold over tin rooftops, there stood a house so proud it seemed carved from the arrogance of its owners, and within its shining walls, a young maid learned that wealth can turn mercy into a myth. The Olanrewaju mansion rose from the red dust like a declaration, a gleaming fortress of marble and mirrors whose fountains spoke in the language of excess. Its bronze gates never closed quietly. Even metal learned to echo its mistress's temper. To strangers it looked holy, white walls, polished floors, and perfumes that pretended to be air. But those who lived inside knew that the house itself held its breath each morning, waiting to discover who would suffer next. Madame Olanrewaju, draped always in imported silk, walked through its corridors like a queen rehearsing her own legend, her laughter sharp enough to slice a conscience in half. She had learned that in Lagos, reputation is louder than virtue, and so she fed hers daily, sprinkling fear where empathy should have grown. Amaka entered this world through the servants' gate, on a dawn that smelled of soap and anxiety. She was barely 20, small enough to disappear in the glare of chandeliers, but her eyes held the tired wisdom of someone who had already bargained with life. Her mother had sent her to the city with a blessing and a warning. Work hard, but do not let them make you forget your name. Inside these walls, names dissolved quickly. They became girl. You there? Stupid one. Yet Amaka carried hers quietly, hidden beneath obedience. Each morning she scrubbed the same floor that reflected the shoes of people who would never see her reflection, and each night she folded her ache neatly with the linens. In a house where the wealthy measured time in imported clocks, she measured hers by the rhythm of insults, short, precise, and relentless. The mansion's beauty was a disguise. Behind the glittering facade lay corridors heavy with resentment, servants who spoke in whispers because silence was safer, and a mistress who believed kindness weakened authority. Madame Olanrewaju's moods ruled the day. If her husband's business prospered, she became generous with orders instead of slaps. But when his calls arrived heavy with loss, her fury needed a body, and Amaka's quiet face always offered the easiest target. The woman's voice could travel from the drawing room to kitchen without losing its venom. Do you call this clean? Are you blind, or simply lazy? And Amaka, steady as prayer, would answer, yes, madam, because survival in that house meant turning each wound into invisible ink. Still, somewhere deep inside her, a thought began to stir, a small forbidden question about how long humility could live without turning into ashes. Evening brought a strange peace to the estate. The electric lights hummed, the fountains whispered their rehearsed melody, and the city outside buzzed like a memory Amaka could no longer touch. She liked to pause by the rear veranda where the scent of wet earth still smelled honest. There she could almost hear her mother's voice, could almost remember laughter without consequence. Yet the spell always broke. A bell would ring, summoning her back to polish someone else's reflection. Among the staff, she was respected, but pitied, admired for endurance that looked too much like surrender. That girl's patience will save or kill her, the cook once muttered, shaking his head. Amaka pretended not to hear, but the words followed her through every chore. Inside, Madame Olanrewaju prepared for another of her endless gatherings. The chandeliers were lowered for cleaning, the crystal glasses aligned with military precision, and the air filled with the tension that precedes storms. The madame's husband drifted through the preparations like a ghost of wealth, silent, detached, his indifference the quietest cruelty of all. He saw Amaka only as part of the furniture that kept the house respectable. When he nodded in her direction, it was less acknowledgement than accident. Still, she found herself wondering whether he, too, had once been kind, before this house swallowed him whole. As twilight spread its violet skin over the garden, Amaka felt something change in the air, a density, a promise. She could not name it, but it brushed against her skin like static before lightning. That night's party would be different. She sensed it in the hurried steps of the servants, in the sharp edge of Madame Olanrewaju's smile, in the way even the chandeliers seemed to shiver, though no wind had passed. She rehearsed her tasks carefully. Carry the wine, keep your eyes lowered, stay silent no matter what is said. These were the rules carved into her bones. Yet beneath the discipline, something restless moved, the faint memory of a girl who once believed silence was holy, but was beginning to suspect it might be a curse. By the time guests began to arrive, the mansion had transformed into a theater. Cars exhaled wealth at the gate, music fluttered from hidden speakers, and perfume thickened the air until it was difficult to breathe. Amaka moved through the brightness like a shadow sown to other people's pleasure, her tray steady even when her heartbeat was not. She heard laughter that did not belong to joy, only to people afraid of quiet. Every sound in that hall, clinking glasses, polite applause, the low murmur of conspiracies, pushed against the edge of her patience. She wondered how a home could be so full and still echo loneliness. When Madame Olanrewaju entered, applause erupted. She basked in it, radiant and merciless, the goddess of her own creation. Her gaze swept the room, found Amaka, and paused for the briefest second. At that moment, the maid understood that recognition from a tyrant can feel more dangerous than neglect. The madam smiled, a small sharp thing that promised a test before the night was over. Amaka lowered her eyes, gripping the tray, until her knuckles whitened. She prayed silently, not for protection, but for restraint, because she could feel the storm inside her gathering shape. Later that night, beneath the chandelier that glittered like a crown made of ice, a single glass would slip from hands that had never failed before, and the hush that followed would cut through music like a blade through silk. In that fragile silence, the first crack would appear, not in the glass, but in the spell of obedience that had kept Amaka's pain chained. And by the time the echo faded, pride itself would feel the tremor of its coming downfall. Nights of celebration often hide the sound of something dying quietly beneath the laughter, and sometimes the first crack of destiny arrives not from thunder, but from the breaking of glass. Inside the Olanrewaju mansion, music and arrogance danced together, weaving a performance that glittered too brightly to notice the shadows waiting to bloom. The evening had unfurled with the grace of a royal play, every guest shimmering in gold and expectation, their perfumes mingling with the scent of imported roses. The chandeliers above threw down a light so perfect it seemed to deny the existence of sorrow. Madame Olanrewaju glided through her empire of wealth like a goddess sculpted from ivory and fire, her laughter echoing off the marble floors in rhythms rehearsed for admiration. Every smile she gave was currency, every compliment a weapon polished with charm. And somewhere behind her, brilliance moved Amaka, the quiet maid whose hands trembled, not from fear of work, but from the weight of invisibility. She carried a tray heavy with crystal glasses, their thin rims catching light like captive rainbows. Each step she took was a prayer disguised as movement, and every breath was measured so her trembling would not be seen. Around her the air swelled with laughter, that hollow kind of joy that rich people perfect, joy that feeds on silence, and feeds silence in return. To Amaka, the music was distant thunder, the smell of wine too sharp, the brightness of chandeliers almost cruel. She felt the night stretching too tightly, the way the air does before a storm. Her heart raced, her body moved from instinct, but her spirit had already begun to fracture under the pressure of perfection. At the far end of the hall, Madame Olanrewaju watched, her eyes sharp as mirrors. She saw Amaka's trembling and mistook it for incompetence. In a world ruled by pride, gentleness is often misunderstood as weakness, and mercy, when offered, is seen as foolishness. The moment arrived without warning. Amaka turned slightly, her hand brushing another guest's sleeve, and one crystal glass slipped from the tray. The sound of its fall tore through the laughter like a blade slicing silk, sharp, sudden, and absolute. For a single heartbeat, the room forgot how to breathe. The music faltered. The chandeliers seemed to dim, and in that terrible pause, every pair of eyes found Amaka. Madame, River Aje's face hardened. Her smile died mid-gesture, replaced by something colder, older. A cruelty inherited, not learned. "What have you done?" she hissed, her voice cutting through the silence. The guests looked away, pretending interest in their drinks, pretending they were not watching a sacrifice about to begin. Amaka dropped to her knees, gathering the shards with bare hands, each fragment drawing thin lines of blood that sparkled under the light. "I'm sorry, madam," she whispered, her voice trembling like the last note of a prayer. But apologies in that mansion were never meant to be accepted. Madame River Aje stepped forward, her heels striking the marble like the ticking of judgment. She raised her hand and struck Amaka across the face. The sound was crisp and echoing, the kind that makes even music ashamed to continue. The first slap was followed by another, then another, until Amaka's vision blurred and her body swayed with the rhythm of humiliation. "Useless thing," the woman spat, her voice growing louder with each blow, feeding off the fear in the room. "Do you know how much that glass costs? Do you think people like you belong among things this fine?" No one moved. The orchestra stood frozen, instruments in hand, eyes wide with helplessness. Even the guests who muttered sympathy under their breath would later describe it as unfortunate, not unforgivable. When the madam finally tired of her performance, she gestured to the guards. "Get her out of my sight." The guards obeyed. They dragged Amaka through the polished hall, her blood leaving faint stains on the floor, the only trace of truth in a room built on lies. She did not resist. Her body was weak, her spirit fractured, yet her silence carried a power no one recognized. At the threshold, she turned once toward the lights that had witnessed her shame. Her eyes glistened, not from tears, but from a stillness so deep it frightened even the guards. Then the gates opened, and the night swallowed her whole. Outside, the air was different. The laughter from inside the mansion drifted faintly, a ghost of celebration mocking her pain. She stood beneath the heavy sky, barefoot, bleeding, the taste of dust and salt on her lips. The city slept, unaware that something ancient had just awakened within the heart of a broken girl. Her chest rose and fell slowly, her gaze fixed on the house that had expelled her like a curse. For the first time, she didn't pray. For the first time, she simply listened. To the pulse of her blood, to the wind moving through the trees, to the faint murmur of a world that seemed to whisper her name. As the iron gates slammed shut behind her, their echo rolled through the night, like distant thunder. The laughter inside faded, but in the silence that followed, another sound took its place. The quiet, dangerous heartbeat of destiny awakening. Beneath her bruises, something stirred, slow and alive, promising that pride had just sown the seed of its own destruction. When the world rejects you, the spirits begin to listen, for the earth does not throw away pain. It buries it until the rain comes to awaken what has been silenced too long. Rain fell, as if heaven itself had decided to mourn the forgotten. The streets of Lagos, glittering hours earlier with the arrogance of celebration, now ran with dirty water and fragments of Amaka's broken faith. Barefoot, her feet bleeding, her uniform torn, she stumbled through puddles that swallowed her reflection and spat it back, distorted. Behind her, the mansion still glowed against the horizon like an insult, every light a reminder that the powerful slept soundly while the humiliated wandered without shelter. Each drop of rain stung her skin, but it was not the cold that made her shiver. It was the emptiness spreading through her chest, the kind that no prayer had yet been strong enough to fill. She moved without direction, guided only by the rhythm of thunder. The city blurred into noise and water until the streets gave way to a lonely stretch of ground where the world thinned into silence. there stood an old bridge, its pillars blackened by time, its underbelly echoing the slow drip of forgotten tears. Amaka collapsed beneath it, her breath trembling, her hair plastered to her face, her hands clutching the mud as though she could anchor herself to something still alive. "Why, Lord?" she whispered, her voice breaking between sobs. "What have I done that even my shadow has turned against me?" The rain answered with the steady indifference of heaven. Minutes bled into hours. Her mind drifted between memory and darkness, her mother's voice, the taste of roasted maize, the laughter of children who still believed the world could be kind. Slowly, the storm softened. Its roar became a whisper, and within that hush she sensed she was no longer alone. From beyond the curtain of rain came the shape of an old woman walking with the patience of eternity. Her shawl shimmered faintly, as if woven from the mist itself, and her eyes, those strange glowing eyes, held the color of storms yet to come. Amaka tried to speak, but her voice failed her. The woman knelt beside her and brushed the mud from her cheek with fingers that felt neither warm nor cold. "Child of sorrow," she murmured, "your pain has called us from deep places. The world of men may not see you, but the river beneath it has heard every tear you have ever shed." Amaka wanted to ask who she was, but before the words could leave her lips, the woman placed a hand on her forehead, and the world tilted, folding into silence. The rain ceased, the bridge vanished, and a new sound filled the air, the hum of something vast and unseen, like water learning to remember its own power. That night, the cry that left Amaka's lips was no longer a prayer to heaven, but a summons to the spirit world. Beneath the trembling sky, her name was carried into places where ancestors still watch, and something ancient stirred to answer, something that had been waiting centuries for a voice brave enough to call it home. Every tear that touches the River Aje wakes something ancient beneath its waters, for sorrow, when it reaches its final breath, becomes the language of the spirits who never forget. The night carried Amaka and the old woman away from the city's noise into a silence so deep it seemed carved from another age. The rain had stopped, but its memory lingered in the scent of wet leaves and the trembling air that followed storms. The old woman walked ahead without haste, her steps sinking lightly into the mud, her form half shadow, half light, as if the forest itself made way for her. Amaka followed, her feet bare, her breath shallow, her mind still tethered to disbelief. Each step drew her farther from the world she had known and closer to something she could not name, something both terrifying and tender. Above them, the moon appeared through torn clouds, pale and watchful, illuminating a path that had not been visible moments before. The forest grew denser, its trees standing like ancient witnesses whispering to each other in the language of leaves. The air shimmered faintly, alive with an energy that prickled against the skin. Fireflies gathered ahead, moving in deliberate circles as though performing a ritual of welcome. Then Amaka heard it, the sound of water that was not merely water, a deep rhythmic pulse like a heart beneath the earth. The old woman stopped and turned. "We have reached the River Aje," she said softly. "It does not flow for mortals. It waits for those who have been broken beyond recognition." Amaka stepped closer. The river glowed faintly under the moon, its surface neither calm nor wild, but aware, moving with purpose as though it listened to its own secrets. She felt its pull before she touched it, a whisper inside her chest urging surrender. "Step in," the woman said, her voice low and steady. "Let your sorrow be washed into strength, and your pain remember its purpose." Amaka hesitated. The water's light reflected her face, a face swollen from tears, streaked with dirt, stripped of everything she once was. She closed her eyes, whispered her mother's name, and stepped forward. The first touch of the river burned like fire disguised as mercy. It crawled up her skin, searing her wounds and her memories in equal measure. Pain rose through her body like a storm seeking release. But within it was another feeling, something fierce and liberating. Her heart pounded, her breath shattered, and then the world broke open into silence. She saw flashes, her mother smiling, the mansion's cruel laughter, the faces of those who had trampled her worth, and each image dissolved into light that sank into the current. The water rose higher, wrapping around her shoulders, her neck, her face, until she could no longer tell whether she was drowning or being remade. When she finally emerged, the forest had changed. The air bowed around her, bending slightly as if in reverence. The old woman watched without expression, her eyes reflecting both pride and sorrow. Amaka's skin glowed faintly under the moon. Her wounds were gone, her fear replaced by a quiet power that hummed within her bones. The river behind her shimmered brighter for a moment, then stilled, its surface smooth and knowing. She looked down at her reflection and gasped. It was her and yet not her, the same eyes but now ancient, the same face but now timeless, the same heart but no longer helpless. The old woman approached slowly. "You have walked through fire and come out whole," she said. "The River Aje does not lie. It gives back only what you truly are. You are no longer a servant of men. You are the hand of balance." Amaka looked toward the horizon, where the mansion of her pain slept beneath the stars. Something inside her stirred, not hatred, not vengeance, but the deep, steady knowledge that justice has its own rhythm and that its time had come. As the first light of dawn broke across the forest, the river whispered her new name into the wind, and every leaf seemed to bow in recognition. The maid who had been beaten and cast away no longer existed. In her place stood the spirit of justice, reborn from sorrow, ready to return to the world that had forgotten mercy. There are nights when the heavens themselves hold their breath, waiting to see what a wounded heart will do with the power it has been given. And beneath the silver hush of the moon, the wind begins to whisper one name. Amaka. The forest no longer sounded like a place of this world. It breathed. It listened. After the River Aje had remade her, Amaka stood at its bank, feeling the pulse of water beneath the soil, every drop echoing inside her veins. The old woman, that silent keeper of forgotten paths, moved around her drawing symbols in ash and river clay, marking the ground where flesh would learn to speak the language of spirits. "The world broke you to prepare you," she said, her voice neither gentle nor cruel. "Now you must decide whether you rise as a healer or a storm." The words clung to the mist as Amaka lifted her eyes toward the moon and felt its cold mercy slide across her skin. Training began at dusk, when the forest glowed like the inside of a dream. The old woman taught her to listen first, to the sigh of roots drinking in the dark, to the cries of unseen things that carried messages older than time. Slowly, the elements bent toward her. Leaves swirled when she exhaled. A branch would crack when she narrowed her thoughts. She learned to call the wind not by force, but by memory, for the wind already knew her pain. At her command, it rose, circling her body in ribbons of dust and light. Soon she could shape flame with her breath, calm thunder with her voice, and read truth in the trembling of water. Yet each victory stitched anger tighter into her heart. Power fed her strength, but vengeance fed her purpose, and the two began to blur until she could no longer tell which she served. The old woman watched with an unease that smelled of rain before lightning. "Child balance is not born of rage," she warned. "You can punish the wicked and still lose yourself among them." But Amaka's mind drifted always to the mansion, the polished cruelty, the laughter that had followed her into the night. In her dreams, she saw Madame Olanrawaju's face reflected on the river's surface, mocking, fearless, unrepentant, and each dawn she woke with the taste of storm on her tongue. She practiced harder, longer. Her body no longer tired, her shadow grew larger than her shape. Sometimes the trees bowed when she passed, and the air crackled around her like cloth rubbed against lightning. One night, Clouds rolled in so the stars had promised calm. The forest darkened, trembling as if bracing for a truth it could not hold. Amaka raised her hands, and the storm obeyed her like an eager pupil. Wind tore through the canopy. Lightning braided itself around her wrists. Rain spun in a perfect circle without touching her. She had become the center of chaos, the calm within fury. When she lowered her arms, silence returned. But the old woman knew the silence was dangerous. She stepped closer and spoke softly. "You have mastered the storm, child. But tell me, can you still hear your own heartbeat beneath its roar?" Amaka said nothing. Her eyes, once warm with hope, now glimmered with something vast and uncertain, half mercy, half retribution. As the thunder faded into the distance, the wind carried her name toward the sleeping city. Somewhere beyond the trees, the mansion still stood, proud and untouched, unaware that its reckoning had already been born. And while the river whispered caution, Amaka's pulse answered with promise. The storm she commanded was no longer outside her. It lived within, waiting for the night she would finally let it loose. The past never forgets the footsteps of those it wronged. It waits patiently, silent as dust on the door it will one day cross again. And when it returns, it doesn't knock. It simply steps back into the place where it was broken, wearing a calm smile that hides the storm behind its eyes. The city woke under a dull gold sky, its morning air heavy with the scent of wet earth and distant smoke. The Rever mansion glittered as it always had, its proud walls echoing the laughter of those who had learned nothing from pain. Madame Rever sat at her breakfast table, surrounded by silver and sunlight, sipping her tea, as though arrogance could be swallowed with sugar. Months had passed since that night, the night of the broken glass, and she had buried the memory under layers of wealth and justification. "Servants are replaceable," she had said once to her husband, her voice cold, her conscience untouched. But the world she ruled had begun to tilt in silence. At Aje, first it was small, a flicker in the hallway lights, a mirror that cracked without cause, the echo of footsteps where none should have been. The servants whispered, the guards crossed themselves when they thought no one watched, and even the air seemed heavier, as though it carried a secret it could no longer keep. Then, one morning, the gate opened by itself. The guards swore later they had not touched it. Through the mist of dawn, a figure in white walked slowly toward the house. The gravel beneath her feet did not crunch. It sighed. The guards stood frozen, their voices dying in their throats as the figure came closer, tall, graceful, radiant, and unbothered by the wind that tugged at her veil. When she stopped before them, her face emerged from the light, calm and hauntingly familiar. It was Amaka. The maid they had dragged bleeding into the night now stood before them, wrapped in the serenity of something unearthly. "Tell your mistress," she said softly, "that I have come to bless this house." Her tone was gentle, almost kind, but the air around her tightened, as if afraid to breathe. Inside, Madame Rever's teacup trembled before she touched it. The head servant ran in, stammering, "Madam, she's here. The girl Amaka." For a heartbeat, time stopped. The walls seemed to lean inward, the chandeliers swayed though no wind had entered, and a sharp chill crawled down her spine. "That's impossible," she whispered, but the color drained from her face before pride forced her to stand. "Bring her in," she said, her voice cracking beneath its polish. The mansion held its breath as Amaka crossed the threshold. The marble floor reflected her image, but the reflection moved a second slower, as if reluctant to follow. Every servant she passed lowered their gaze, sensing both awe and fear in her silence. When she reached the grand hall, Madame Rever waited, her face composed into its usual sculpture of control. "You've returned," she said, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. Amaka's gaze lingered on her, unreadable, calm as the surface of deep water. "I came to give what I owe," she replied quietly. The old woman's hands tightened around her rosary. "And what is that?" she asked, voice trembling. Amaka's smile widened a fraction. "Balance." As the sun climbed higher, a faint wind swept through the mansion, carrying with it the scent of river water and something older than time. The mirrors along the corridor quivered, rippling as if struggling to contain their reflections. That night, when silence returned, every mirror in the Olanrewaju mansion would whisper a single name, and pride would finally remember what fear felt like. No wall can silence the voice of guilt once it begins to speak, for guilt is a spirit without flesh that seeps through stone, sleeps inside mirrors, and breathes in every room where truth was buried alive. The mansion had always thrived on noise, laughter, orders, and the endless clinking of wealth. But after Amaka's return, silence became its new master. Even in daylight, the house seemed dimmer, as though the sun itself hesitated to touch it. The servants moved with the fragile caution of people walking through a dream that might turn into a nightmare at any moment. They whispered that the air had changed, that the walls were listening. Madame Olanrewaju, however, dismissed their fears with a brittle smile. "Superstitions," she said. Yet, in the privacy of her own reflection, she could feel it too. The shift, the weight, the unseen eyes tracing her every movement. It began with the mirrors. One afternoon, as she dressed for a meeting, she noticed a thin crack splitting her reflection in half, a hairline fracture running straight through her eyes. She blinked, and the glass shattered completely, scattering her image across the floor. The sound echoed too long, like laughter dragged through water. That night the chandelier in the hallway swayed without wind, its crystals chiming softly, whispering rhythms that resembled her name. The next morning, the servants refused to enter the west corridor, claiming they heard footsteps behind them, though no one followed. The house that once stood as her pride had turned into a mouth murmuring confessions she had never made. Sleep no longer visited Madame Olanrewaju kindly. Each night she dreamt of water, dark, endless water, and from its depths rose Amaka's face, calm and terrible, her eyes glowing with the light of judgment. "Balance," the voice would murmur, the same word Amaka had spoken the day she returned. Madame would wake, gasping, the bedsheets damp with sweat, her heart pounding like a drum of guilt. She prayed, but every word dissolved before it reached her tongue. Even the rosary on her nightstand felt heavier now, as if unwilling to be touched by hands that had blessed cruelty. Her husband, usually calm in indifference, began to change as well. He spoke less, drank more, and wandered the halls at night muttering that someone was calling him from the garden. Servants reported hearing laughter echoing from the empty ballroom, a slow melodic sound that belonged to no one alive. Dishes fell from cupboards without touch, portraits turned slightly askew, and the air grew colder with every passing evening. The family's guests stopped visiting. Rumors spread that the Olanrewaju's wealth had awakened something unholy. In truth, it was not a curse that haunted them, but consequence, an echo of cruelty returning to its source. By the third week, fear had stripped Madame Olanrewaju of her elegance. Her voice, once sharp as a knife, had softened into whispers of apology muttered to shadows. She wandered her rooms in silk robes that no longer commanded respect, her hair unpinned, her eyes hollow. At dinner, she startled at every creak of wood, every flicker of flame. "It's her," she told her husband, her voice trembling. "She's here, in this house." But he only stared into his glass and said, "Perhaps she never left." Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of the River Aje, faint but unmistakable. The lights flickered, the air thickened, and somewhere deep within the mansion, a woman's laughter echoed once more, soft, distant, and heavy with promise. As night settled like a veil over the Olanrewaju estate, the mirrors began to breathe, their surfaces rippling as though something beneath them wanted out. And in that trembling glass, the servants swore they saw a figure standing behind Madame Olanrewaju, draped in white and smiling. The spirit of the girl they had destroyed had come home to collect her debt. Pride always throws a feast on the eve of its own funeral. It lights candles for its delusion, dresses shame in gold, and calls witnesses to applaud a victory that no longer exists. In the Olanrewaju mansion, laughter returned, not because peace had come, but because fear demanded disguise. After weeks of silence thick enough to choke, Madame Olanrewaju decided that terror could be banished by sound and spectacle. The house, still whispering from the corners, was commanded to prepare another banquet. Servants who had begun to pray in secret now polished the same silver that trembled in their hands, while the scent of roasted meats and imported wine fought to cover the sourness of dread. "Let the city talk," Madame said, her reflection glimmering in the mirror she had ordered replaced. "They will see that I fear nothing." The mirror did not answer. It cracked again that evening, a thin white scar stretching across its center like a warning unheeded. By sunset, the mansion glowed like a shrine built to arrogance. Torches lined the drive. Musicians tuned their instruments beneath a sky already bruised with storm, and guests arrived wrapped in perfumes and pretense. They came partly from loyalty, mostly from curiosity, each one eager to see whether the rumors of ghosts were true. When Madame stepped into the hall, her gown shimmered like molten gold, her smile bright enough to blind herself. "Tonight," she announced, "we dine, and the dead stay silent." Applause followed, fragile and uncertain, swallowed quickly by the music that erupted to keep courage alive. The chandeliers blazed overhead, their crystals scattering light across the room like 1,000 tiny suns refusing to set. Servants moved swiftly, filling glasses, refilling laughter, pretending not to see the flicker that passed through every flame. Madame's husband sat rigid, his eyes hollow, his wine untouched. He could feel the tremor beneath the marble floor, a slow heartbeat that did not belong to the living. Yet pride, that faithful parasite, kept him silent. The feast pressed on. Halfway through the evening, a draft crept through the hall, though every door was shut. The candles wavered. The violin stuttered. A cold ripple passed through the guests so sharp that conversation faltered, mid-sentence. Then the lights dimmed, not all at once, but as if the darkness were swallowing them one by one, tasting each flame before devouring it. The musicians stopped. The only sound left was the soft clinking of nervous hands against the crystal. Madame Olanrewaju rose. "Enough theatrics," she snapped. "Someone fix the lights." No one moved. Somewhere beyond the walls, thunder rolled like a slow drum announcing its audience. The great doors groaned open. A wind swept through the hall, curling the draperies, scattering petals from the centerpieces. At first, the guests thought it was the storm, until they saw her. Amaka stepped over the threshold, draped in white that shimmered like moonlight filtered through water. Her eyes caught every reflection, her presence still and terrible. "Did you miss me?" she asked, and her voice did not echo. It resonated, as though the walls themselves were answering yes. Madame Olanrewaju's wine glass slipped from her hand. The crash was swallowed by a deeper sound above, the metallic groan of chains giving way. The chandelier tore free, plummeting toward the grand table. Glass exploded, candles died, screams splintered through the darkness. Smoke and dust filled the air. Guests stumbled, tripping over luxury that moments ago had made them proud. Amid the chaos, Amaka stood untouched, the faint glow around her body the only light in the room. "I came to bless this house," she whispered again, and the words were soft enough to be prayer, fierce enough to be judgmental. Madame Olanrewaju fell to her knees, her hands shaking, her voice barely a breath. "Please, what do you want from me?" Amaka's gaze did not soften. "To return what you gave," she said. The candles relit by themselves, their flames now blue, casting the hall in a ghostly hue. Paintings twisted on their hooks. Eyes inside portraits rolled toward the mistress. The floor seemed to pulse like living skin. Guests clawed at locked doors, calling for help that would never come. As the final candle flickered out, the mansion inhaled as if drawing breath for the first time in years. Then came the sound, low, mournful, endless, the house itself weeping through its walls. In that darkness, one truth remained. The feast was over, but the hunger of the dead had only just begun. The truth is a living fire. It sleeps beneath silence, feeding on lies until the day it burns through the skin of falsehood, and when it rises, even the gods close their eyes. That night, as thunder bled across the sky, the River mansion stood trembling, unaware that the hour of revelation had finally come to collect its debt. The air was thick with the perfume of ruin. Smoke from the fallen chandelier curled lazily toward the ceiling, blending with the stench of melted wax and fear. The once grand hall now resembled the belly of a wounded beast, its lights dim, its marble floor cracked, its mirrors trembling as though exhausted from keeping secrets. Madame River clutched the edge of a table for balance, her diamond earrings catching what little light remained. Around her, guests huddled in terrified clusters, their finery smeared with dust, their voices reduced to shivers of disbelief. Amaka stood in the center of the chaos, her white garments flowing like water around a rock, her eyes reflecting both fury and sorrow. "This house has spoken for years," she said quietly, "but you never listened." Her words slid through the air, soft and cutting, and the silence that followed was not emptiness, but anticipation. The pause before a storm decides where to strike. The first sound came from the walls. A low groan, almost human, rose from deep within the structure, spreading like a sigh through the hallways. Then came the cracks, thin spidery lines that crawled across the marble like veins of darkness, pulsing faintly with light from beneath. The guests gasped as the very house began to bleed, black streaks oozing from its corners, dripping down framed portraits, staining the perfection that had once been its pride. "What is this?" the madam screamed, but no one answered. The air carried whispers now, voices tangled and restless. Each whisper carried a memory: servants unpaid, promises betrayed, rivals ruined, innocence crushed beneath ambition. The mansion had become a mouth, and every wall was a tongue reciting confessions. Madam's husband stumbled forward, his face pale, his breath shallow. "Make it stop," he rasped, reaching out to Amaka. But she stood unmoved, her expression unreadable. "It is not I who speaks," she said. "It is the truth you built your life upon." Her words struck like thunder. The mirrors cracked all at once, shattering into hundreds of pieces that clung to their frames, each fragment reflecting a different sin: the bribes, the betrayals, the hands stained with the tears of the powerless. The guests, desperate to escape, rushed toward the doors, but the handles refused to turn. Pride's palace had sealed itself. Amaka raised her hands slowly. The air shimmered, and a pulse of invisible power rippled through the hall. The black liquid from the walls began to rise, curling into shapes, forming faces. Faces of servants long gone, eyes wide with accusation. Their whispers grew louder, weaving into a chorus of grief. "You built your wealth on our silence," they cried. "You fed your glory with our suffering." Madame River sank to her knees, shaking her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "Stop! I didn't know," she cried, but the spirits laughed softly, a sound more pitiful than cruel. "You always knew," Amaka answered, her voice trembling not with anger, but with something deeper: remembrance. "You saw us. You heard us. You just chose not to care." The storm outside roared louder, a lightning splintering across the windows, and with each flash, the faces of the dead flickered in the glass. The floor quivered beneath their feet, The grand piano toppled with a crash, and the house groaned like a creature giving birth to its own ghosts. Madame crawled forward, reaching for Amaka's hem. "Please," she whispered. "I beg you. Have mercy." For a moment, Amaka's glow dimmed. Behind the spirit's calm, she felt the ache of the girl she once was. The girl who had once begged for mercy, and received none. Her heart clenched, torn between vengeance and forgiveness. The river's voice echoed faintly through the storm, whispering balance, not destruction. Amaka's hand wavered. The power within her pulsed violently, hungry for release, yet something human still lived beneath it, fragile but alive. The small voice that once knew love, the voice that still feared becoming the very monster she had destroyed. Her eyes closed, and tears, silver and quiet, slipped down her cheeks, burning the floor where they fell. When she opened her eyes again, the blue light in them had dimmed to a soft gold, and the storm outside paused as if holding its breath. The truth had been spoken, the proud had been broken, yet deep within her chest, mercy began to stir like a forgotten heartbeat. Whether it would save her, or destroy her next, remained to be seen. There are storms that roar to destroy, and there are storms that whisper to remind the world that innocence still breathes among the ruins. Amid the shattering of pride and the crumbling of power, a single cry rose, fragile, pure, and small enough to silence the wrath of heaven itself. It was not the cry of the guilty seeking mercy, but of the innocent begging to live through another dawn. The mansion groaned under the weight of its confessions. Every wall had spoken, every secret had been dragged screaming into the light, and yet the air refused to rest. Smoke and ash swirled like memories too stubborn to die. The chandeliers hung like broken halos, their glass still trembling from the power that had consumed the feast. In the center of that desolation stood Amaka, the spirit reborn from sorrow, her face pale with exhaustion and the residue of vengeance. The glow that had once surrounded her now flickered, uncertain, like a lamp caught between wind and darkness. She had fulfilled the call of justice, yet her heart was not calm. The cries of the proud had faded, but her own soul would not quiet. Then, from somewhere deep within the wreckage, a sound rose that did not belong to ghosts or thunder. It was soft, thin, desperate, the cry of a child. Amaka froze. The power swirling in her chest stilled instantly, listening. Again it came, a whimper muffled beneath splintered wood. She turned toward the fallen table, her eyes narrowing as blue light bled faintly from her palms. Beneath the shattered grand table, amid broken plates and shattered glass, a small girl crouched, the River Aje's daughter, her face streaked with tears and dust, her body trembling as she whispered, "Mama, please." The sight struck Amaka with the force of memory. For a heartbeat, she was no longer the spirit of the River Aje, but the maid who had once cried in that same house, praying to a god who had stayed silent. Her hands trembled. The power around her pulsed, reacting to emotion it did not understand. The voice of the ancestors whispered faintly through the smoke. "Justice has been served." But another voice, softer, followed. "Mercy must follow." Amaka hesitated. The storm outside screamed for vengeance. The river inside her pulsed for balance. Slowly she stepped closer, her garments whispering across the floor, each movement heavy with conflict. The child looked up, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Don't hurt me," she sobbed, shrinking farther beneath the table. Amaka's throat tightened. No spirit could have spoken the words that followed, only the woman she had once been. "Hush, my little one," she whispered. "You are safe now." She knelt and gathered the child in her arms. The girl's small frame fit perfectly against her chest, her heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. The power inside Amaka softened, curling around them both in a quiet, golden glow. "Shh," she murmured, rocking her gently. her voice breaking. "The storm will not touch you." Around them, the house groaned again, but this time the sound carried sorrow instead of fury, as though the mansion itself wept for what it had witnessed. Madame Olanrewaju lifted her head from the floor. When she saw her daughter cradled in Amaka's arms, something within her broke. Her hands trembled. Her voice, once sharp enough to wound, now trembled like glass. "Please," she whispered, crawling forward. "Please don't take her from me." Amaka turned toward her, her eyes glistening. The power that had once burned like vengeance now felt like a chain around her heart. "I came to take nothing," she said softly, "only to give back what was lost." The river's voice echoed again, louder now, an ancient chorus carried on invisible wind. "The measure is full. The scales are balanced. Let peace return." As the words filled the room, the blue light in Amaka's hands began to fade, replaced by a warm gold that flickered like morning sunlight through water. The walls stopped bleeding. The cracked mirrors mended themselves. The black stains on the marble began to recede. One by one, the candles relit, their flames soft and steady. The spirits that had lingered bowed their heads before dissolving into air, their purpose complete. Amaka stood, still holding the child. "Sleep," she whispered, and the girl's eyes fluttered closed, her breathing evening out against Amaka's chest. She turned toward Madame Olanrewaju, who was now weeping openly. "You built your kingdom on sorrow," Amaka said, her tone quiet but sharp. "Let your repentance rise where your pride once stood." Madame nodded, words failing her. She could not speak beneath the weight of her guilt and relief. Outside, dawn began to push against the edges of the storm, bleeding light through the clouds. The first rays of morning slipped through the broken windows, painting Amaka in gold. Her garments, once white as the river's foam, now shimmered faintly with a hue that felt human again. The ancestors' whispers faded into the distance, their duty done. Only one voice remained. Her own. "It is finished," she breathed. "Justice and mercy have met." She walked toward the great doors, her steps echoing softly through the now still mansion. Behind her, Madame Olanrewaju knelt beside her daughter's empty cradle, her sobs mingling with the sighing of the wind. As Amaka reached the doorway, the broken doors opened on their own, as though the world itself bowed in her passage. Outside, the garden glistened with rain, and the scent of the river lingered on the air, not as a curse now, but as a memory. She stepped into the morning, her figure dissolving slowly into the light. The child stirred in her arms, murmuring in her sleep, and Amaka smiled, not with triumph, but with peace. The storm within her had finally quieted, though the silence it left behind felt almost unbearable. She looked toward the horizon where the river met the sky and whispered, "May I be forgiven." The wind carried her words back toward the mansion, wrapping them in the scent of rain. Behind her, the house stood still, reborn, but haunted by its own redemption. And as Amaka disappeared beyond the gates, the morning sun caught her tears, turning them to light, proof that even vengeance, when touched by innocence, must bow to mercy. Every fire believes it can erase what came before, but when the flames die, truth stands among the ashes like a ghost refusing to be forgotten. The dawn that follows such ruin is never gentle. It does not comfort, it reveals. And when the first light broke over the Olanrewaju mansion, it did not rise on victory, but on judgment fulfilled. The world awoke to silence. Not the soft silence of peace, but the heavy, hollow quiet that follows destruction. The Olanrewaju estate, once a monument of gold and arrogance, lay in ruins, a blackened carcass of stone and memory. The grand pillars had collapsed into themselves, the chandeliers melted into rivers of glass, and the proud crest above the doorway hung askew, half devoured by smoke. The air was thick with the scent of wet ash and iron, and above the wreckage, The sky glowed faintly with the weary light of dawn, like a candle burning over a grave. Through the drifting smoke, two figures emerged. Amaka walked slowly, her bare feet leaving faint prints on the soot-black earth, the hem of her white garment torn and streaked with the remnants of battle. In her arms, she carried the Rewaju's young daughter, the only living echo of innocence that had survived the night. The child's head rested on her shoulder, her small hand curled trustingly against Amaka's chest. Together they moved like a vision, one born of flame, the other of mercy, stepping from ruin into morning, as though carrying the fragile thread of life that the storm had spared. Behind them, the fire crackled faintly, sighing its last breath. The Rewajus were gone. Their pride, their wealth, their empire, all reduced to the dust they had once used to grind others down. Yet even in their absence, the house seemed to remember them. The scorched walls moaned softly, as if lamenting their fall, or perhaps whispering thanks for release. The villagers arrived slowly, drawn by the rising smoke and the strange quiet that followed. Men removed their caps and bowed their heads. Women pressed trembling fingers to their lips, and children hid behind skirts, peering out with wide, uncertain eyes. "Is it true?" one voice whispered. "The maid brought the fire?" Another voice answered, "No, it was the gods. She was only their vessel." Some stepped forward to offer blessings. Others crossed themselves and turned away, afraid to meet the eyes of the woman who had faced the wrath of heaven and walked through it unharmed. Amaka did not speak to them. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon where the forest met the sky, a pale shimmer of green and gold in the distance. The villagers' whispers swirled around her, some calling her cursed, others calling her chosen, but she heard none of it. She carried the child closer to her heart and kept walking. The world behind her was finished, the world ahead uncertain. Every step felt like a question to which only the river could answer. As she reached the edge of the village, the morning light fell fully upon her face. It revealed not the fury of a spirit, but the exhaustion of a woman who had borne too much truth. Her eyes, once burning with divine light, now shimmered faintly with something human again: grief. The child stirred in her arms and looked up sleepily. "Are we going home?" she asked, her small voice trembling. Amaka paused, her breath catching in her throat. "Yes," she whispered, though the word wavered. "Home." She knew the mansion was gone, and the home she once knew had never truly existed. But perhaps beyond the forest, the river would show her what home meant now. The villagers watched as she passed beneath the morning sun, her silhouette framed in gold. To some she was a curse walking away, to others a saint returning to where she belonged. None dared to follow. The ashes of the Rewaju's house still smoked behind them, sending thin gray fingers of smoke into the sky like confessions rising to heaven. The elders murmured that balance had been restored, that the ancestors had spoken and the river had claimed what was hers. But even they could not say whether Amaka's journey was finished or merely beginning. The path to the forest was narrow and overgrown, its soil damp from the night's rain. The scent of the River Aje floated faintly in the air, sweet, ancient, familiar. Each step Amaka took seemed to stir echoes beneath the ground, as if the spirits themselves followed her passage. The child hummed softly in her arms, unaware of the weight that clung to every heartbeat of the woman who carried her. At the threshold of the trees, Amaka stopped and turned back one final time. The sunrise had deepened into a full day, bathing the ruins of the mansion in gold. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw movement in the smoke, a figure bowing its head before dissolving into light. Perhaps it was a trick of the wind. Perhaps it was forgiveness. She turned back toward the forest, her face calm, her steps steady. The wind moved through the trees like a sigh, carrying whispers of water ahead of her. The path curved downward toward the river, the same river that had remade her, the same current that had turned her pain into power. Its voice rose again, not as a demand this time, but as a gentle song, calling her, welcoming her, reminding her of the promise she had yet to fulfill. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the distant surface of the River Aje. Its waters shimmered like a mirror waiting for her reflection, its current humming the melody of unfinished stories. Amaka hesitated only once before stepping into the shadows of the forest. The river's whisper reached her again, soft, unending, patient. It called her name not as a summons, but as a homecoming. Every legend is born in silence, when the world has stopped screaming, when fire gives way to ash, and the wind begins to remember a name it once feared to speak. Power may fade, kingdoms may crumble, but what is touched by the river never dies. And on that dawn, when the smoke had cleared and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, the River Aje began to whisper again, calling its daughter home. The forest stirred long before the first light touched the ruins of the Olanrewaju mansion. Mist coiled through the trees, like memory returning to its source, carrying with it the scent of water and the faint hum of ancestral voices. Amaka walked the narrow path that wound through the woods, her steps slow but certain, the child still sleeping peacefully in her arms. The glow that once burned fiercely around her had softened into something calmer, like moonlight learning to rest after storm. Behind her lay the ashes of pride. Before her, the promise of return. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of wind, seemed to bow as she passed, for even the forest knew when it was in the presence of one who had become legend. When she reached the riverbank, the world fell utterly silent. The River Aje stretched before her, vast and glimmering, its surface rippling with the colors of dawn. The same waters that had once burned her flesh now shimmered with welcome, alive with the power that had remade her. It was no longer a place of testing. It was home. Amaka stood at its edge, the child stirring faintly in her arms, and for a long moment she could not breathe. Every memory returned in a flood. The night of her death, the touch of divine water, the voice that had named her justice. And beneath it all, she heard a quieter voice, her own, asking at last for rest. She knelt beside the river, setting the child gently on the soft grass. The little girl's eyes fluttered open, hazy with sleep. "Are you leaving?" she whispered, her voice fragile and small. Amaka brushed a strand of hair from her face, her fingers trembling. "Not leaving," she said softly. "Becoming." The child did not understand, but she smiled anyway, the way innocence smiles at what it cannot yet lose. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Amaka hesitated, her heart tightening with a pain deeper than vengeance. "Whenever you hear the river sing," she replied. "I'll be there." A ripple disturbed the water's surface, and from the mist stepped the old woman, the guardian of the river, timeless and calm. Her white shawl glowed faintly, her eyes carrying the light of 1,000 dawns. "You have walked your path," she said gently. "You have carried the fire of justice and the seed of mercy. Both have grown in you, and both now must rest." Amaka bowed her head, her strength finally yielding. "I have done what was written," she whispered, her voice heavy with both relief and grief. "But my heart is still human. It still remembers pain." The old woman smiled, a smile that reached deeper than comfort. "Even the river remembers pain," she said. "That is why it never stops moving." She extended her hand toward the water. "Come, daughter of sorrow, spirit of balance. The river waits to carry your story where no pride can touch it again." Amaka rose, her eyes lingering once more on the sleeping child. The forest light flickered across her face, catching the shimmer of tears that glowed like molten glass. She took a step into the river, then another, the current swirling around her ankles, cold, yet tender. Each step seemed to unbind her from the world, the weight of vengeance, the scars of cruelty, even the ache of forgiveness. When the water reached her heart, She turned toward the sky and whispered, "Thank you for letting me be heard." The river's song deepened, echoing her words back as waves of light rippled outward from where she stood. The current rose, wrapping around her like an embrace. Her body began to dissolve into mist, her form becoming one with the current. The old woman watched in silence, her hands folded, her expression neither sorrowful nor proud, only knowing. The river turned red for a single heartbeat, glowing like liquid fire beneath the sun, and then cleared again, pure and endless. Where Amaka had stood, the water now shimmered in soft gold, the air alive with the faint sound of her laughter carried through the wind. The villagers who later came to the river told stories that would outlive generations. Some said they saw her face reflected on the Aje surface during the rains. Others swore that on nights when injustice stalked the land, the river bled crimson and the wind wailed with the cry of the forgotten. Children were warned not to lie or harm another by the water's edge, for the river had eyes that missed nothing. "Speak truth," the elders would say, "or Amaka will rise again." Seasons passed, but the legend did not fade. The forest grew denser around the River Aje, protecting its sacred current from those who sought to profit from it. Travelers came to its banks to wash away guilt, mothers to pray for their children, and lovers to swear vows they dared not break. And always, the water shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight, carrying whispers in its flow, the voice of a woman both mortal and divine, who had learned that justice without mercy is a wound that never heals. One night, long after the fires of the mansion had been forgotten, the river rose higher than usual. The villagers stood at the banks, watching in awe as the water glowed crimson beneath the moon. They feared it was a sign of punishment, but the color soon shifted to silver, calm and radiant. A soft voice drifted through the night, the same voice that had once turned storms to silence. "Balance endures. Let mercy stand." The wind carried the words across the forest, and the villagers fell to their knees, understanding that their guardians still watched over them. And so the river kept its promise. It flowed through generations, through kingdoms that rose and fell, through men who learned and men who forgot. When pride stirred in hearts too hardened to learn, the river trembled, warning the earth of its patience. And when justice wavered, a ripple of crimson would streak its waters, a reminder that the spirit of Amaka still flowed within, waiting, eternal, the maid who once served, who rose against cruelty, and who became the river that ended the pride of the mighty. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade like the echoes of the river. Let it live by sharing it forward. Subscribe now and join our family of souls who believe that every tale carries a truth worth remembering. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Amaka's place? Your voice keeps these legends alive, and the next story awaits only the brave who stay till the end.